Now I will slightly change my role, and now from a presenter I become a chairman, and I would like to introduce the first speaker of the day, who is Professor Paolo Carafa from Sapienza University. Hello, Paolo. Many of you may wonder what an expert in archaeology has to do with ion channel research. And actually, the short answer is nothing, but he has a lot to do with the place which is hosting us, Rome, and the history of Rome. So Paolo is an expert in Roman topography and computational archaeology. And since most of you will not be able to visit Rome in this occasion, he will guide us through the layers of a very representative place in Rome, which is the Palatine Hill, whose history goes all the way from the foundations of Rome to the place where the palace at the center of the Roman Empire stood. And it's really a stone throw from here. So with that, Paolo, I would like to thank you for joining this workshop, and leave the floor to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much once again. And I was saying I am really happy to share the result of our latest activities on the Palatine Hill. Here is our place. The Palatine it is still the core of our over 35 years long activity in Rome. You can tell here the Colosseum, Circus Maximus, and the hill, as we can see it now today, full of ruins and green areas. If we think in terms of ancient city, we can tell that such a hill has been an important center for the city. In this slide, you see the Palatine here within this gray area all around, which is the area of the city at the middle of the 8th century BC. Then the red line represents the limit of the new city at the end of the 6th century BC, and in the end, this huge space here, divided in 14 parts, represent the surface of the Imperial Rome. So from the limit of a new city, the Palatine has been turned into a deep core of a larger city and of an even larger city at the center of an empire. The Palatine is a small place, was a small place and still is a small place. It's a not too high hill, which is reaching such a level, which was originally surrounded by streams, small rivers, and also marshy areas. And it stood in this place more or less like a small peninsula. And the most relevant part of this place was this corner here. It was called the Germanus, was the ancient name. And this name is quite interesting because the Latin words Germanus come from another Latin word Germani, which means brothers. And the brothers par excellence in ancient Rome were Remus and Romulus, that is, the twins who founded the city. In this slide, you can see the back of a bronze object that can be dated back to the end of the 4th century BC. At the center of the image, you can tell the twins and she-wolves, which was suckling babies. All around Romulus here, who is indicated by this man with a spear, we can see other figures, such as this man with a sheep coat and this a bird here, which is a woodpecker. The two men, a bird, are indicating the presence of the earliest mythical figures, the divine kings that, according to the Roman legends, had ruled over the Latin people in the origin of this land. So in some way, since at least the end of the 4th century BCE, the twins were connected to the very origin of Latin culture. That is to say that the founder of Rome and therefore the Palatine were connected since the origin to the origin of the Latin culture. But the second character has been related to such a place, and he was the first emperor of Rome, Caius Julius Caesar Octaviano, with at the end was also called Augustus. The name of this man is a history in itself. His real name was Gaius Octavius, like his father. When he was still very young, he has been adopted by Julius Caesar, and he had to change his name in Caius Julius Caesar Octavianus. When he became an emperor, the Roman senators decided to call him Augustus, which means a grown-up man in sense of majesty and his power. The one, Romulus, founded Rome. To amuse ourselves in these scenes, we can see the founder, which is pulling a furrow, creating a groove, indicating the limit of the new wall of the new city. We had to imagine this happening at the northern foot of the Palatine Hill, right in the place where we could identify the remains of a gate dating back to the mid of the 8th century BC. The second man, Augustus, lived on the hill, and by the way, also founded the empire. Here is a reconstruction of the house of the emperor. We will explain this image in a while later. And these two founders were deeply connected to such a place. They were deeply connected to Palatine Hill, especially with the southwest corner of the hill. And this is the reason why the history of this very special place can tell us a lot, can reveal the history of these two men. And this is why we need the archaeological history of places, because we can mine from that the history of historical men. The archaeological history of this place has been inaugurated during the wide excavation carried on in the second half of the 19th century. And this excavation was carried on by this famous archaeologist, Pietro Rosa, and this is the first plan of the revealed ancient Palatine. The excavation cleared the latest layout of the hill, but such ruins in a while became more and more famous, and they have been documented in a more and more accurate way. This is another famous plan drawn by the archaeologist Lanciani, who, by the way, was also an engineer. And the goal was to let the scholars all over the world analyze, know, and study the remains of the core of the empire of ancient Rome. Soon after, also a new phase of excavation, which went deeper and deeper in the soil, started at the beginning of last century. This man, Valieri, cleared up, you can see here, the surface of the bedrock of the hill, revealing these holes. These are holes for wooden posts sustaining the hut and the roof and the walls of huts. And these lines here, you can see, are the trenches where the clay wall were inserted. This is the map drawn by this man. And for the first time, the very early features dating back to the Iron Age had been uncovered. And this meant that the history of the hill could have been read over a very long period of time. Since last century, the amount of available information for an archaeological history of the hill and of Rome as well as a whole has increased in an incredible way. And we ourselves, my colleagues and I, last and maybe least, have spent last years in classifying all these informations. We filed any evidence in an information system we created and patented, and we call it the Archaeological Information System. And out of that, we draw the first archaeological plan of Rome, the one after the Lanciani's plan we have just seen. This new image of the ancient city let us present what we call the tale of the landscape of ancient Rome. And we presented this in a form of an historical narrative in the Atlas of Ancient Rome. The Atlas of Ancient Rome is, at the moment, the one experiment in telling the history of a city revealed by the changing architecture and its changing topographical layout. In the slide, you can see two images representing the hill. This is the corner we'll be dealing with in a while, at the end of the 2nd century BC, and here at the beginning of the 1st century AD. The archaeologists call this kind of plan phase plans. That is, plan representing just a single given moment in time. And these figures can be used like frames in a film, and comparing them, we can identify changes on the one hand and continuities on the other hand to show the history of places. And so this is what I would like to share with you, the history of the most important part, of the most important hill in Rome, seen through its changing landscape. So here we are, the Palatine, the Germanus, and phase plan number 1, the beginning of the archaeological history of this place. During the 9th century BC, in between the end of the 10th century and the beginning of the 9th, Rome has been occupied by a very large settlement extending over 200 hectares, and this corner is just one part of this wide settlement. At the beginning of the 9th century, the settlement is limited to this darker area, and then soon after it expanded on this side. We can tell two main features: a sanctuary here dedicated to a goddess, Pallas. She was the goddess of the shepherds and sheep. It's a very ancient deity, but is nonetheless very important because Romulus dedicated the foundation of Rome to such a goddess. And a second feature, a large house which was part of this Iron Age settlement. The sanctuaries is so ancient that it's a very simple form. We have a fireplace in the middle surrounded by a fence resting over a system of tunnels and wells cut in the bedrock, and here you see the layout of this very early hut. The archaeological informations here are very relevant. We can follow the changing shape of this sanctuary. The fireplace in here always stays here and is always surrounded by a fence, changing the layout more or less. And at the middle of the 8th century, something is changing. This is the period when the Romans thought that the city had been founded, and A part of the earlier settlement is upgraded here in this sacred area. The fireplace is larger and the fence is less weak, but other sections of this previous settlement are changed. Here you see in this section how the wells are connected by these galleries here with the sanctuary on top. And here we see the new layout of this corner. This is the very place where the Romans thought that the celebration right to found, that the right to found their city had been performed by a founder. They are very precise in indicating this place. They say it was near a temple, which will be later built up, and especially on top of this street, it was a huge staircase called the Scale Cagi. So this is the memorial of the foundation of Rome. And at the middle of the 8th century BC, we have two huts, and in front of them, there's a pit excavated in the bedrock, and the altar is carved in the bedrock as well. According to the literary sources, the founder dug a pit, filled this pit, built an altar, lit a fire over this altar, and pronounced the name of the new city. So this is what the archaeological feature reveals about the possible reality beneath this mythical rite. Since this moment on, the surrounding landscape will go on changing its shape, but for this corner here. At the end of the 6th century BC, the original hut is still there and visible. A new sanctuary is laid out here, and you can see the original hut still visible with the pit and the altar still there. During the 5th century BC, a new temple is created. There's a reshaping of this area. A new platform is created here to host a new hut. At the beginning of the 3rd century, new temple, and the place of the origin is narrower and narrower, but nonetheless, we have the pit, an altar, and a hut. Here you can see the narrow space. This is the original pit right in front of the temple. Then a second temple is created, and an enclosed area is created here with an altar right on top of the previous pit and the new hut suggested here. And since this moment on, during the 2nd century BC, this will be the definite shape of this lake, which will last until the end of the empire. Such a continuity is very impressive on the one hand, but is an evidence in itself. This place should have been really very relevant because it becomes a landmark in the changing landscape. And once again, during the 2nd century, a third small temple is added here, and this place is still here with this altar and the place for a new hut. So in front of these two huge temples, there's a narrow space full of history. In this narrow space, we have seen an original hut dating back to the 9th century BC, a second hut with a pit and a new altar in front dating back to the middle of the 8th century BC. This situation lasted long until the 2nd century BC, when a new hut has been created in front of an altar resting over a pit, which has been created in the middle of the 8th century BC. Once again, material feature, continuity, relation with the Roman memory. This was a landmark of the Roman myth. And this was the situation in this place when Octavian decided to move to this place, to change his house, and in a few words, he became the neighbor of the founder Romulus. The relation Octavian had with such a hill was very tight. He was born in this corner here, We do not know much about this previous house, but we know the location exactly where this house had been stood, because later on a temple had been created where the first emperor was born. Then he moved on the opposite corner of the hill. Soon after, he has been adopted by Caesar, and at last he moved right in front of the place where the city had been founded. We know a lot about this new monument. These are the staircase. This is the place where the memorial is. And this is the previous house Octavian bought from a famous lawyer, Hortensius Ortalus. And it's a typical aristocratic Roman house with an atrium here, a peristyle, and a number of rooms. As times went by, Octavian upgraded this house. This is the famous house with these wonderful paintings, pine festoon, the cubiculum of the massive, quite famous, at least in archaeological terms. And the surface of the house has been doubled. This is the area of the previous house with a peristyle and a number of rooms here. A second peristyle is created here with a second group of rooms. This was quite an elaborated architecture. Here you can see the bedrock, the remaining part and still visible part of this house in gray, and in black and white, a possible integration of the original building. This house was resting not just on bedrock, but on a sanctuary. This sanctuary has been created in a cave, thought to be the cave where the she-wolves would have suckled the founder. So once again, a memorial of the foundation of Rome connected to the house. Octavian is not yet an emperor, but as a matter of fact, it seems to have already decided which kind of relation he would like to establish with the origin of the city. This is the subterranean chamber, and a second section, once again, to show the first peristyle and the second peristyle. All we see today is the underground floor of a house resting on top of that. This is a possible image of the facade, the entrance to the sanctuary and the cave, a retaining wall sustaining the rocky cliff of the hill, and the huge mass of this new house created by Octavian. And once again, to amuse ourselves, this is a possible idea of how these monuments look like. Now, Octavian bought this house in year 42, more or less, and he stayed there for a number of years. Suddenly, in year 36, we know this thanks to the literary sources, a thunderbolt struck this house. Octavian was terrified by storms and lightning and thunders, but as he was a very clever politician, he turned such a terror into his own advantage. And he declared that a thunderbolt had struck his house because the god Apollo was claiming that house. So he had to give his house to a god, of course. And more than this, he had to upgrade his house to turn the house into a palace worth of a deity. And therefore, this house had been cleared away, backfilled, and became the foundation for a new and larger palace. Now in this session, we see in red color the remaining feature we can still see today. We have one block represented by the house with paintings, a number of foundations, and a new temple resting on top of this. Now, the way the features are connected one to the other reveal the archaeologist the correct sequence of what happens in time. Therefore, we can tell that The house was there. This house had been surrounded by retaining foundation, backfills, and then over all this, a new palace has been created with a temple in it. We know the story, we know the location, we know what happened and when, but we do not know how this new palace looked like. Here in this slide, you see just 9 or the number of hypotheses that has been presented to figure out how the first imperial palace of Rome could have looked like. Such a situation in archaeology, in different scientific fields as well, means that there's a need for new analysis, and this is what we did. This is the phase plan of any feature that can be related to this palace, and this is the starting point to try to understand how the original monument looked like. We have surely 2 limits, because we have streets running here and here. We have a third limit here, where a huge foundation is still running, and within this space, we can identify a number of blocks. The more relevant block is this one, which is the foundation for the new temple that had to be dedicated to the god who claimed the house. And the point is that this line here, where you can see the number 8, is not the proper limit of the house, because this wall is not a foundation, but a retaining foundation, and created there to enclose the huge backfill that would be created there. And more than this, it is overarched by a concrete vaults, a system of concrete vaults. You can see in the drawing and in the reality, this is what remains of this vault, meant to sustain a strange arrangement for an open garden. This arrangement has been created using typical Roman bricks with steps, with the name of this guy, Cosconius. We know this guy was a very famous guy who created bricks around the second half of the 1st century BC. So this is the reason why we have to look on the other side of this wall, down on the slope, to try to integrate the missing part of this first palace. Now a number of views and plans dating from the late Renaissance to the modern age attest a number of very imposing structure, no more visible. You can see here arches and at least 4 stores. A number of arches is peeping out here over the roof of the church. Here is even clearer. You can see 1, 2, 3 stores with gates and arches. Here, once again, this is another view of the Palatine. This is the southwest corner, and once again, we see a number of arches. During the 18th centuries, not very much of all these were still there. You can see just 3 rooms surviving. And this is the area where we have been operating during the last 2 years. This is the situation now. We had drill cores, we had geophysics, we had test trenches to read and analyze the surviving structures. And we plotted once again all the results of this investigation on a map. We inserted in the archaeological information system, and we assess the features we had starting from this point. Here we have the facade in blocks of a building with a large gate, and the remains of 2, 3, 4, 5 other stores spanning from the level of the street, dividing the Palatine from the Circus Maximus to the floor of the temple of Apollo. So this is the resulting plan, the blocks we have already seen, the inner part of a wide terrace sustained by a substructure. We can see partially here, here, and in the remaining part where we have been investigating. This is a possible view of a facade. And here you can see the new relation established in between the new palace, the early sanctuary, and the monumental entrance to this new palace. Once again, a section, the lower house, his backfill, the new house, the new structures, the early sanctuary, and here you can see the lintel of the gate we have seen in the previous slide. So this is more or less how we can now imagine the first palace, the first emperor of the Roman Empire, created in between the surface of the place where the ancient believed that the twins had been suckled, and in front of the place where the ancient believed that the foundation rite has been worshipped. This is another view to show the relation between the terrace and the temple of Apollo. Now the question is, where is Augustus in this building? Where did he actually live? All we have seen, even if very substantial, is just a huge substructure, a terrace, and a temple. Now, according to the literary sources, we know that Augustus lived with two gods, Apollon and Vesta, and that the area dedicated to Vesta had been enclosed in a sector of the house which he wanted to make public. It was open to the Roman people. So, according to the plan we have been able to identify, we have a terrace and a sanctuary, a public part, and a private part. So this is the area where the first emperor actually lived. And now we can go back to this image we have already seen. This is the private part of the most powerful man of the Roman Empire. During the first century AD, this incredible sanctuary palace or palace sanctuary became suddenly the origin for a more gigantic architectural complex. Around the mid of the first century AD, a new wing of a new palace has been attached to the private part of the house of Augustus. This is the Temple of Apollo. This is the backside of the Temple of Apollo. And a few years later, towards the end of the first century AD, a larger palace has been developed from the public part of the house. Here you can see this is the monumental dining room of the later emperor with fountains all around. To conclude, the Germanus is the one place in Rome where we can compare the mythical memories of early Latin culture, the legend of the foundation of Rome, and the history of the empire. The archaeological features are fragments of a lost reality, but even though they can be assessed in a chronological sequence and reveal the changing shapes of buildings and places, and this turns the artifacts into processes and history. In one word, we archaeology also have theories, experiment, and simulation in our own way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for this tour through the layers of the Palatine, and also this beautiful view of what archaeology is. And so we have plenty of time for questions. And let me tell to all the participants that they can pose questions in the public chat at the right of the platform. And I will read them, and the speaker will answer them. To break the ice, let me start with one general question for Paolo. Paolo, as a computational scientist myself, I'm very curious to know something more about computational archaeology. What is it, and how does it actually help into this difficult business of relating the layers of Rome, so the architectural remains with documents and with the difficult task of dating the different layers.
Well, thank you for the question, first of all. And well, the basic need we have is to locate precisely features in time and space. This is the first step. To locate features in time, we have a method, we have a procedure. We can date archaeological layers, we can identify building techniques, we have descriptions, as we have seen with brick stamps. But the correct image and location of these features is substantially aided by IT, because the image we can have will be much more precisely stated than any other method, not to say with a rubber pencil and a piece of paper. So basically, we have been supported with a greater precision in defining the information we have. Apart from that, the information system is an incredibly powerful tool in relating things. It's much easier, it's much faster, and it enables us in dominating an incredibly vast amount of information, which could, well, maybe not impossible, but it will be surely much longer to manage in traditional ways. More than this, we also have what we call predictive models and algorithms that can help us in managing the possible association and the variation of something during time or space. But this is not strictly correlated to the analysis of the architecture or narrow spaces, such as what I try to explain here. But on a larger scale, especially with the distribution of artifacts, distribution of habits, cultural habits, alimentary habits, of diseases, ancient diseases, for example. This is very, very useful as well.
Thank you very much. I do also have a curiosity concerning the so-called Lupercal. So I know that there have been recent excavations and there have been different interpretations. So you think that you have arrived to the final interpretation of this place, which seems located in a place of very great symbolical importance, as all the emperors want to sit right there on top of it?
Well, in some sense, no interpretation is final. We are still debating, even arguing sometimes about it. It depends, of course, on the kind of information we have. We know that such an ancient sanctuary was at the foot of the Palatine Hill in the Germalus, but we do not know precisely where. Some ancient authors say it was along a street leading from the Roman Forum to the Germalus, which is not such a precise indication. But other authors say that it was in Circo. This means very close to the Circus Maximus, not in the center of the arena, of course. And this is one piece of information we have. From a topographical and archaeological and architectural point of view, now we know there's a deep cave in the hill, decorated with very luxurious mosaics and paintings, including an eagle, which is not just a figure, because only the emperor could use that symbol by that time. We know that the cave is in some way enclosed in the first imperial palace, so we can assume that it is possible that that place was so relevant because it could have been connected to the original Rome. This is not so easy to explain while telling the history of the Germans, of course. There's a message I cannot.
Yes, thank you. There's a message from the audience. How difficult is it to, from Roland Roth in the audience, how difficult is it to do this work in the middle of a city as busy as Rome? Well, I can partially answer that it's already difficult to come here near the Colosseum, but excavating it.
It's not that difficult because the Germanus is quite completely included in the archaeological park of the Palatine. So it's a reserve, it's a sort of archaeological national park. So it's not that influenced by the problems affecting the rest of the urban area. And it's even also a very quiet place. So it's not that difficult anyway.
Sorry, I had another curiosity. Why was the Palatine seemingly abandoned after the fall of the empire, and also other areas nearby seem to be deserted?
Yeah, well, between the end of the 5th century and the beginning of the 6th century, due to diseases and wars, the population of Rome had been reduced from around 1 million people to less than 100,000. And the city was void because not many people lived in there. And also, this part of the city was the Imperial Palace, that is a sort of a forbidden city. No one could live in there. And when the emperor was away from Rome, there was a number of people serving the emperor, attending the emperor, preserving the palace, guards, waitress, and people like that, servants. And at the end of the empire, when the political power of the emperor was no more there, these huge structures had been abandoned. Imagine we have to close the parliament and let it there for some hundreds of years. It will be abandoned. And soon after, between the 7th and the 8th century BC, scatters of people lived again in the area, and they grouped around new churches that had been founded at the foot of the hill. Then the noble family of Rome created strongholds around the hill with small castles, and then the life was increased once again, until the whole hill was turned into the huge garden of one noble Roman family, the Farnese, and the Palatine became the Farnese garden.
Okay, we have several questions from the audience now. So the first one is from Thérèse Malievin. How the geology of the site changed during the centuries, and how much does it influence your observations? And then, let me read the three of them, and then you can answer them in the order you prefer. So Sophie Marbach asks, studying the hill, how often are you on field compared to analyzing data, for example? This is very relevant for us because we ask ourselves how much work we do in the lab and how much work we do on the desk. And finally, Luca Maragliano, thanks for the interesting talk. Are there specific technological advances that has been possible to associate to the realization of the site, as for example, building techniques or sewer networks? So first the geology, then how much field work you do as archaeologists,
and then techniques and building
and technological advancements
and things like that. Okay, geology. The geology of the Palatine has been assessed before the appearance of the human beings on the hill. The original hill has been cut through the earliest river Tiber. So the most ancient part of the hill is the one facing the actual river. The northern part is a later sediment accumulated by the flowing of the river all around the original hill. And so from this point of view, the geological structure of the hill did not change since the ancient times, apart from small earthquakes and things like that. But the structure of the hill is quite clear and I would say permanent. Nonetheless, it is very relevant to investigate the more solid layers of the hill, because those are the parts of the hill that could have been used for sanctuaries, for example, as we have seen, or for building materials. So we look at the geological structure of the hill in these terms, rather than in terms of history of the place, the shape of the place. Second question, labs and fields. This is the quarrel we have with our students, libraries and open air, or libraries and class and open air. The balance is 1/3, 2/3, more or less. Every 2 months in the field, you need a seminar season of several months. Otherwise, the information you gather would be too much complex, too much relevant to be managed in an effective way. So we have to find a balance between, you need both anyway, desk and labs and libraries and field. But of course, it's one organization. It depends on which kind of phase of the procedures of collecting and analyzing evidence you are involved in. And the technological issue. It is not safe to assume that historical thresholds are immediately reflected by technological innovation. So there's no direct connection in between a unique and relevant historical event and the evolution of the techniques. They are rather parallel stories which has to be read, each one on its side, and then eventually compared. But of course, the capacity and the ability of Roman architects and engineers increased through time, especially between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD. That is the golden season for Roman architectures, and that is the period where the more complex structures had been realized and projected in some sense.
Thank you very much, Paolo. While I look for other questions from the audience, I had perhaps a last curiosity. So, was the palace of Augustus named after the Palatine, or was it the other way around? And in case, what was the previous name of the Palatine?
The previous and the Roman places could have different names at the same time. In this case, the whole hill was called Palatium, which is the hill we call Palatine today. But the same name, Palatium, was also the name of just one part of the hill, the eastern part of the hill. And the other part of the hill was the Germanus. So there were sub-names of the hill. But then the house of Augustus was not called the palace, was called the house of the Palatine, Domus Palatina. And the remaining part of the imperial palace have also been called Domus, with the name of the emperor. Domus Tiberiana, the house of Tiberius. Domus Flavia, the house of Flavius Domitianus, and so forth. Domus Neronis, for example. And the modern word we use, palace, comes from Palatium, which is the name of the Palatine, not of the palace.
That's also sort of archaeology in archaeological memory in our language, which is, I find, a very nice way to end this talk, and to thank you again for this beautiful talk. And thank you again, Paolo.
Thank you very much.